Hey everyone, welcome to Dear Frannie. I am your host, Catherine LeBlanc, founder of Franchise Fractionals. Today I am joined by Marina and Chris. We are talking all things tech, and I'm excited to jump into this week's question. But first, I'm going to let Marina and Chris introduce themselves. Chris, we'll start with you.
Awesome, thank you. It's exciting to be here. My name is Chris Peterson. I'm the CEO of the Restaurant Assistants and Franchisee. The Restaurant Assistants, we do outsourced accounting and outsourced technology for restaurant groups, anywhere 3 locations up to hundreds of locations. Franchisee is a software reporting tool for franchise systems. So franchisees can understand where they fall within a franchise group and how their metrics compare to other franchisees around them.
And Marina?
Hey, Catherine, I'm Marina O'Rourke, and I'm a fractional CIO with T-Source IT, and we provide fractional IT resources to growing brands.
Awesome. I am so excited to have you guys and jump in, but first I want to hear about what you are reading, and I expect it to be really techy and geeky, so I can't wait to start. Chris, tell me what you're reading.
Yep, it's not. I'm currently rereading Simon Sinek, Start With Why. The main purpose being that a lot of times, especially in the restaurant world, we always forget what the foundation is of why we're doing what we're doing, especially from a tech perspective. Why is it we need the tools that we actually need? And so it doesn't have to do with restaurants or technology, but it's been just a good kind of sounding board again of why it is that we're making the decisions we're doing and the direction we're headed.
And I'm going to piggyback on that before we talk about whether or not we read it. So I read that one, but my book is also from Simon Sinek. It's called The Infinite Game. And in addition to, I mean, Simon is just, his foundational philosophies are just super on point. What I like about this one is that he spins the kind of culture that we are all used to and you know, in our kind of sports-centric world of winning. Everybody has to win and be a winner. And if you're not a winner, you're a loser. And he puts that on its head in his book on the Infinite Game. And he said, okay, it never ends. The game never ends. And if the game never ends, what are the possible outcomes? Right. And so instead of thinking about winners and losers and, you know, we've got to beat them and you know, this language that creates negativity essentially because somebody's got to be the loser. It's really more about kind of how do you continue the journey and how does everything on your journey become part of that infinite game. So I wanted to piggyback off of what Chris was saying because, you know, I mean, he just does such a great job of kind of teaching you business solutions that really apply to life as well. Chris, have you read that one yet?
I haven't, so I'll make sure I add it to the next step.
Yeah, awesome. Marina, have you read either of those?
You know, I have actually not read either of those. So those sound like books I need to add to my list. Yeah. I'm kind of getting into newsletters these days. So James Clear has a great newsletter, 321. He's the author of Atomic Habits, and I love his newsletter. And also there's a great guy that I found on Instagram. His name's Jefferson Fisher, and he's a trial lawyer and, quote, professional arguer. And he teaches you, especially how to have effective conversations, sometimes with people who might be being toxic with you or when you're in challenging situations. I mean, he is a trial lawyer. And so I get a lot of good tips from him. Just because, you know, being Italian, I have found sometimes that the mouth engages before the brain. So that's an area of continuous improvement that I'm always focused on.
Oh, that's awesome. I love that. And you know, the Atomic Habits was a game changer for me. It's a great book. I haven't gotten James's newsletter yet, but I'm going to check that out. Awesome. All right. Well, we're going to jump into our question, but first, a little note from Franchise Fractionals. Dear Frannie is brought to you by Franchise Fractionals. Scaling your franchise doesn't mean going it alone. With Franchise Fractionals, you have access to the top tier talent you need when you need it. From finance to operations and marketing and tech, our fractional executives have been where you want to go. Don't let the full-time commitment of executive roles hold you back. Visit franchisefractionals.com today to discover how our leaders can help pave the way for your franchise's success. Jumping into our question for Chris and Marina today, what security measures should we put in place to protect sensitive data? Actually, this is 3 questions. So that was the first one. How can we stay compliant with relevant regulations and standards? And what mistakes have other brands made in building their tech stack that we should learn from? So let's start with that security and compliance question, because I know that we talk a lot about, at least I do, I talk a lot about tech stacks and ecosystems and how they all talk to each other. And I rarely talk about compliance and security and how do you keep your data protected? And that's kind of the boring side of tech, but I think it's essential, right? Because everybody's scared of a data breach and everybody's going to get hacked one day. So Marina, how do you approach those questions when you get asked by franchisors around compliance and data and security?
I think there's a couple of simple principles. I think it can seem very overwhelming. First and foremost, you need to have cybersecurity insurance, and your insurance company is going to kind of give you a list of must-haves to actually secure that insurance. And a lot of them are fairly simple things. Like, you need to make sure that you have good access controls. Pretty much every system today offers you the ability to have multi-factor authentication and strong passwords that you change every 90 days. That's pretty simple, and it's something that's important to do. The other thing is education. So many people are getting caught out by phishing attacks. And just understanding, and having a protocol in place if somebody is asking you for money, to make sure that people don't do things that they shouldn't do. Obviously, there are systems that can help monitor your laptops and other systems that are called endpoint control. But the biggest weakness is human beings, and that education is really, really important. No one should be able to do something to spend money without multiple people reviewing it and okaying it. And then there's also some simple stuff that you need to do to protect your customers' data, right? A lot of franchise brands have got caught up because they don't have websites that are Americans with Disability Act compliant. And they get sued for that, and then they have to fix it. And there's also something called the California Consumer Protection Act, and a lot of those standards are being propagated across states. I hope we get to a single standard in the United States. But essentially, if you can follow those standards and make sure, basically, people need to be able to opt out of programs. And if they want data you've collected, you need to be able to give it to them. So start with some basics so that you don't get overwhelmed.
That's a great tip, because even just talking about compliance and in IT, I get immediately overwhelmed. And those are really small things that are well documented. You just have to Google them and you'll see very, step-by-step instructions on how to be compliant in those areas. That's great. Chris, what do you got?
Yep, a lot of the same things. Marina hit the head on the important ones. The biggest thing that we see is email security. I'm sure Marina's dealt with this too. Being consultants and fractional CTOs, we've dealt with the FBI and other law enforcement agencies for when we get brought into a group because they did have a phishing attempt and all of a sudden somebody got tricked into providing a new bank account for who they thought was US Foods or somebody like that, and they lose a lot of money very quickly, or they make a payment to the wrong bank account and US Foods or whoever the vendor might be still wants their money and you just sent out $30,000 and you're never getting it back. So there's one from a financial security standpoint, email seems to be the biggest thing. Phishing attempts, we try to push as many security measures onto groups as possible. For when we're interacting with a brand, we're going through VPN servers into password vaults in order to get to customer logins, things like that. So it's very, very secure. In a franchise world, it's very hard. Franchisees don't want to use two-factor authentication in their corporate email, or we see a lot of times there's a shared email for the store and you can't do two-factor very easily because you have maybe 3 managers using it, and it's very hard to have that control. So it's this weird push and pull of giving your managers the ability to do their job, but still keeping everything secure. I think it's a challenge we see. Groups aren't utilizing password managers and things where you can use a shared mailbox with control systems still in place. But I think that's the biggest piece. Cyber insurance, super important. And even with that, there's a lot of things that groups aren't doing properly to make sure that insurance is able to be used if there is an issue. We in today's world, everything is cloud-based, and I think everyone should be cloud-based. If you don't have servers on your property that people can access with credit card information or customer data, you relieve yourself of a lot of the issues, and you put it on your vendors that actually control some of those pieces themselves. So if there is a breach, there's other insurance policies with other vendors that come into play that help protect you as a company. So I think that's super important. Payments is one of the biggest areas. I think it's also, we always see hacks. In today's world, there's a good way as a restaurant group or any franchise retail system to push that ownership of data onto your payment processor. Everything is tokenized. If a group is not using EMV payment devices, that's a big red flag. I know of multiple groups that still aren't because it's just more complicated and there's other costs involved.
That's so surprising.
A lot of groups are still just swiping cards. You see with a lot more full service restaurants where you don't see the devices at the counter. But there's chargebacks are a huge thing. There's obviously data is being stored at the restaurant, which now the restaurant is liable for that. If you have EMV, everything's tokenized. It's on the processor at that point, as long as you have PCI controls in place. PCI, it almost seems like a scam because you have to fill out a questionnaire every 3 months, and franchisees don't understand what any of the questions are. So finding the right vendors to help you through that process and make it as simple as possible on the franchisees will help secure customer data, will help make sure you're compliant. So there's a lot of pieces in play, but you need the right partners to help navigate those waters because there's a lot of loopholes that insurance companies, everybody hope you don't hit. So that way, if something does happen, they don't have to pay out. So
that's interesting. I was going to ask, I think, back in the day, credit card data was the big, risk that you're going to get a breach and that everybody's credit cards were going to be stolen. And that's where, some changes were made with the EMVs, with PCI compliance. And so you don't hear about credit card breaches as much anymore. And to y'all's point, it is the email, right? So the email is a trusted source. They copy the trusted source email nomenclature, and that's how they get you in. So that's interesting. I didn't realize kind of where that kind of hacking piece shifted. And I can't believe there's still people out there that haven't switched over to EMV. That is a pretty basic, guardrail against being PCI compliant and getting that credit card data protected. So those are good tips. Marina, did you have anything to add based on what Chris said?
There's 2 other things that I was thinking of, Catherine. One of them is network security and making sure that if you segment Wi-Fi for public access, even if you're a franchisor, when guests come into your office, they should have their own separate Wi-Fi. You want to have somebody help you administer your network. That's super important to make sure there's the right level of security. But the other thing is, do you have a business continuity plan? It's not that hard to write, but you need to imagine, what if data got held hostage or you had a breach? What are you going to do? Envision a scenario. The CEO is on a plane. Who's in charge? Who makes decisions? Do you have somebody through your insurance company that will help guide you? Do you have a PR plan in place? Yeah. Because if you don't have those things thought out, by the time that it happens, it's too late.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And for me, I've seen those disaster plans get written, and then we review them every year. And we don't use them a lot, but I can't tell you how comforting it was as an employee to know like, okay, this is what I'll do in this situation. And, Marina's talking about data breaches and ransomware attacks and, kind of some stuff around the security side of things. But even as small as, okay, your POS goes down and you can't accept credit cards. What are you going to do? Are you going to give away the food for free? Are you going to take it cash? Because in those situations, when your employees are faced with an unknown, and to your point, you don't have a leader in place or, for whatever reason, but you want your employees to be empowered to say, okay, this is what I'm going to do next. Those plans, writing them down and just having them in a binder to be reviewed, on a yearly basis really can be a game changer when it comes to those stressful situations. So I think that's a great call out. Awesome. All right. So the second part of our question, which is really the juicy stuff, I want to hear from you guys. What are some of the mistakes that you have seen people make when they are approaching technology that you can kind of warn our listeners about? And I'll just leave it really broad to see what you guys come up with. Chris, do you want to go first?
Sure. One, I'm going to quickly touch back on the email systems. It's especially in the franchise world. We don't see the two-factor in a lot of franchise email systems, which we've already touched on. I've also seen a lot of franchise systems where the franchisees are just using Gmail accounts. So they have their own personal emails and they are sharing company information. They're using a Google Drive on their own personal file or their personal systems. And if they sell the franchisee or if they personally get hacked, they could pull in information about the franchise. And it doesn't matter that, oh, it was that person, not us as the franchise. From a media standpoint, doesn't matter. It's the franchise that got hacked, even though it was one person who didn't have the right, they use the same password on every single email account and portal that they've used. So I think having that, it's an investment. Emails are going up in costs. I think I think Google is more expensive than Microsoft now, and that is a very expensive piece, but I think it's important because it also maintains the data that you own as the franchise group. So that's kind of piece one. Piece two is just winging it, kind of we've talked about before. You kind of just put everything in place. You're using your Comcast modem, no firewall, and you're just kind of hoping everything works. We see the things with the Wi-Fi of people being able to access the POS network on the guest network. And so I think if you don't put the right team in place or the right consultant in place at the beginning, you open up a lot of issues. And it's harder, one, from a security retention standpoint of if something does happen, kind of getting back at that. But also, as we know with franchise systems, people hate change. And so if all of a sudden you're locking down systems and you're putting restrictions on and you're saying, hey, you have to use this email, you can't use your personal, after they've been doing it for so many years, you're not going to have as good of feedback, one, from the franchisee, but you're not going to have as good of people actually taking those new processes in place. And they're going to keep using their personal email. They're going to keep doing the things they've been doing because that's what they're accustomed to. So I think everything at the beginning is the most important piece. And that's the big red flag, is people not figuring out towards the beginning before it's too late.
Yeah, no, I think those are great points. Marina, what you got?
So I think there's a pretty simple one that a lot of folks don't think about, and they don't think about what their website strategy is going to be. And they don't necessarily think about ensuring that they're going to be found on Google because they've structured their locations, set up their locations properly. And this doesn't matter what type of brand you are, because first and foremost, people need to find you. And especially if you're a service brand, you can't assume that they're going to necessarily drive by your location. You may not even have a physical location. Right. But at a restaurant brand that I was at not too long ago, we had to spend an awful lot of time just cleaning up locations in the entire website strategy, which with the offerings that are out there today really should not even be happening anymore. Yeah. And then the second thing is having an unqualified person actually set up and administer technology. I was at a brand where there was a individual contributor operations person who was responsible for configuring and managing the point of sale. And I will tell you that it resulted in severe challenges, both at headquarters and for the individual locations, including things like every time a limited time offer went out, buttons disappeared from the POS.
Yep. So I have a question, follow-up question for you on that one. So a lot of times vendors who are offering these platforms and solutions will sell in the support part of their platforms. So I'll try and think of a simple example. So let's just stick with POSs. And when we say POS, we mean point of sale. So you get an operating system in, and it's out of the box. And the point of sale people say, yes, we will be here to support you. But as we know, when you get into it, at the end of the day, if you need some customization, they don't have somebody on their side dedicated only to you, right? Usually they're managing a lot of different accounts. And so that's how that situation happens, right? You get something, they say, oh, we're going to set it up for you. And then you realize like, okay, well, I need more. It's a living thing. You're going to be constantly changing things. And so understanding the resource that you need to support that tool before you onboard it. I see this with LMSs too, learning management systems, where you bring on an LMS, but you don't have anybody in-house actually creating content to live on the LMS. And so, what do you guys think about thinking through that resource need? Or, more so on the vendor side of things, where should you expect the vendor to be that support resource, and where should you be expected to bring that resource to the table? Who wants to go first? Chris?
Well,
Marina?
go ahead, Chris. So I think that you really need to think long and hard about this. If you're going to rely on the vendor, you need to understand that you're going to get their solution out of the box. And especially as a small brand, you're not going to be high on the totem pole to have changes made. So if you're going to rely on the vendor, you have to be prepared to use it as is, and wait in line for your turn and maybe never get a turn. Alternatively, you can choose to hire a system administrator. And this is also the type of role that can be fractional, right? If you're working with the right partner, they should be able to provide you with some part-time resources that have the appropriate IT expertise to effectively administer your system in a way that is going to make sure that things are operating the way that they're supposed to.
Yeah, and I think to clarify and make sure that I'm kind of repeating this in the right way, but it's essentially, it's finding the subject matter expert on the platform and not having to bring that person in-house, but instead, buy a bank of hours or outsource it a little bit. And you're going to save money because you're going to cut back on time from the individual contributor trying to figure out the system and learn it themselves. You're going to get somebody who's an expert in that system. And then you're also going to get somebody that you're directly paying and responsible for versus the vendor who has their own roadmap, who has their own priorities that they're working on. And so you may, have a cheat code to skip the line if you hire that subject matter expert to help you, but doesn't necessarily need to be a full-time resource. Chris, is there anything that you would do differently?
No, I think having the right partner is important. I think if you have a hardware system, software system, unless you're a massive top 5 restaurant group for that system, they're not going to give you much attention. You're going to have to go through their general support. Having the right partner in place that already has connections with that group are going to be very, very paramount. All the partners that we work, software and hardware wise, they would probably tell you that I beat them up a little bit for our clients. We're partners with them. We like the systems, but there's every technology is technology. There's going to be bugs. There's going to be issues, and people don't want to move because a lot of times they don't understand that there is a bug with their system, and it's until it's too late. So having somebody that understands that and can push them really hard, eventually they budge. And having a group that can just take the day-to-day tickets from your franchise system and monitor them. If there's 5 locations with the same issue, that group can see it through the tickets that, hey, we keep having the same issue. We need to go to the vendor and push on this specific subject. Versus if it's just, one person and it's just a wildfire trying to put out these different fires, it's harder to monitor that. And the right partner has other clients. So it might be popping up at other clients and they can bring all this data together for a POS company or this online ordering system, whatever it is, and say, hey, here's all the issues we're seeing across multiple groups, and they can work on fixing that issue a lot quicker. So I think having the right vendor that can just take it all out of the corporate hands and just take control of it, get a solution in place, I think is super important.
And I think the value that I've seen brought to the table when you're talking to somebody who has been in a tech role with other brands before is on both sides of the coin. So on the discovery process of which platforms to identify to fix the problem that you're working on, and then to the point we're talking about now on the inside to understand, how does this system work and how can I make it work for me? I can't tell you how many times I've heard franchisees and owners throw up their hands and say, well, this system sucks. And it's like, well, does the system suck or is your expectations misplaced? Because the system is a system and, it's up to us on how to work it. And we have to understand every system is going to have limitations. And so how are we going to approach those limitations and having someone with experience on the front end to kind of coach you through those expectations and limitations before you get the system allows you to approach the system and the improvements and features that you want to make to the system, I think, a little bit calmer. My experience. I don't know if you guys have, have anything to add. Awesome. Well, this has been great. And I really appreciate the time that you guys have spent talking about technology and franchise brands. Just a wealth of knowledge. So appreciate your participation, and we will hear from you guys next time on Dear Frannie. We can't wait to see you. And if you have a question for Dear Frannie, please email us at hello@franchisefractionals.com. Thank you guys.
Thank you.